Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's Facebook and YouTube live event. I'm Huma, and I'm joined by my co tutor.
Stephen, hello everyone.
Hi, Stephen. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. I'm not bad. And you?
I'm okay. Thank you, Stephen. So, Stephen and I are here today to take a deep dive into teaching writing, specifically generating and organizing ideas across ages, levels, and different contexts. So, viewers, if you're here already, please tell us who and where you are, and please add your questions and comments about generating and organizing ideas to the chat and comments. And tell us how you help your learners generate and organize ideas while writing in their lessons. So, Stephen, as we know, writing is a difficult skill. I think it's
Hmm.
difficult to master the skill even in our own home languages. And quite often, learners think, oh, I can't write, maybe because they don't know where to start or what to say. So, how can we help our learners generate and organize ideas? Stephen. So let's think about primary, secondary, and adult learners.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yes. I think you're right. It's a big question.
Mm,
Um, I think sometimes the issue can be that the learners have ideas, but maybe they can't necessarily do it in English.
mm,
Because I think sometimes it's one of those things we sometimes have in class. Well, I've experienced this where you think, oh, these learners are beginner or they're elementary, so um, sometimes the assumption is they don't know as much because they don't know as much in English, but that's not true, obviously.
mm.
And the learners know a lot in their own language. And I think that's one of the simplest ways to start is actually, I mean, you've talked about this before, Huma, is kind of getting them to
Yeah.
use their home languages to talk about and to generate the ideas. And then the teacher is the person who can then recast it in English and support them with the English for the ideas. Like when they're brainstorming ideas for, I don't know, like a story or something like that. Maybe
Mm.
they've got lots of ideas because they've done stories in their own language,
Oh,
but they
yeah.
haven't necessarily done it in English. So I think that's one place that you can start, especially with lower levels. Um, how about you, Huma? Where would you
Um,
start?
Yeah, I think you've brought out a very good point about helping learners form that bridge between their languages and English because I think there's a starting point, especially for primary learners and also other learners, at low proficiency levels. In my classes, Stephen, when I think about my primary learners, I often tell myself that they think with their bodies, which
Oh
means
yeah.
through movement and yeah, movement and touch senses and interaction. So I think it's important to make writing a multisensory experience for our learners. So maybe,
Hmm.
make it more experiential for them. So for example, bring in objects. So if they have to maybe write about their favorite animal, then maybe you could get ask your learners to bring their favorite plushie, maybe, that's their favorite animal, to class, and then they maybe use it to ideate, to come up with ideas, so and you can give them sentence starters. For example, it looks like, it eats. And I think primary learners are very good at being imaginary. So so they're very good at imagination. So I think maybe they're able to use those objects. We could also have realia stations in our
Hmm.
classrooms where they could go and touch and feel objects. I remember you talking about an activity using food. I remember we discussed that in one of our
Yeah, with the
previous
smelling.
live
Yeah.
events. So I think that's a very exactly, so maybe you could bring in food and they could bring in food from home and they could smell and guess what it is and maybe write about it. So I think there are different ways of making writing a more fun, and also a multisensory experience. Sorry, a multisensory experience for especially our primary learners.
No, that's a really good point, actually. And you reminded me of another lesson I did once, actually. With it was sort of with it was with teenagers, um, but we did it was recipes, so using food again. But
Mm,
what I was quite lucky at the school where I was working. It was an agricultural school, so we had like a. I was able to cook a recipe with them, so I showed them how to do it, and obviously they were kind of taking notes on the steps and the stages, and then they were able to create it themselves. And because we did it together, then they could look at the example recipe that I had and then kind of think about a
Mm,
recipe that they would like to cook for me. So it was kind of like like you said, that's a really good idea. Like the visual, the seeing of it, and
yeah.
the actual doing of it, and help them generate ideas and think about a recipe that they knew and the steps that they knew to do that recipe. So that was really useful. Um,
Yeah, I mean, talking about secondary learners, Stephen, I think ideation then becomes more structured, right?
mm,
And you could then make it more integrated, of course, for all levels and all age groups, but especially for older learners and adults, you can make it more integrated. So you talked about, ideating while doing something. So teachers could also combine that with dictation activities. So learners listen, and
mm.
then they have to, and then after you model something, they come together and they recall what they listened to, and then they come up with ideas and see if they can compare those ideas and produce something similar. So why not? I mean, we could make it an integrated skill in the
Yeah,
classroom.
yeah. I mean, like I think you're kind of touching on like a dictogloss. Yeah. So when you're
Yes.
doing a dictogloss, because that
Yeah.
that gives the learners lots of ideas for something that they could write that's similar.
Mm,
And I think all the ideas we're talking about are also talking about like providing a model for the
mm,
learners. So that's a way that you kind of help them generate ideas for the thing that they're going to do. Like a primary student and even
yeah.
secondary students, they haven't been exposed to so many different types of texts. So we need to give them a model
Yes.
to be able to kind of think, okay, how can I do this myself? And like the classic thing that I've done quite a lot with kind of tweens is the
Mm.
kind of fairy tale, rewriting the fairy tale from different points of view,
Oh yeah.
or kind of ending the story differently, that kind of thing. But I think it's a lot to do with exposure
Mm.
to these models, um, but also kind of generating ideas needs a motivation as well, doesn't it? It needs something to kind of get you going. Um, so how can we help with that? Do you think, like motivating the learners a bit?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Stephen, because quite often teachers have to work with the curriculum that they have, with the course books, and there might be writing activities that are not relevant to our learners. So I think we
Mm,
have to make them more personalized and engaging, especially for older learners and, adults. For example, there could be, a topic write about climate change. Now, I don't think I can write about climate change, off the cuff.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure I'll find myself struggling, to talk about this topic. So maybe, in that case, you bring it closer to home. We talked about climate in our previous live events. So bring it closer to home. Maybe students could start by thinking about their, neighborhood, their community and challenges that they face in their community, and also having an audience and a purpose. I think that can make this exercise more meaningful for our learners.
Mhm.
So write about climate change for your school magazine, or maybe
Yeah,
for your social media handle. I think teens are into social
yeah,
media today.
yeah.
So for your social media handle, so how would you present it? It doesn't have to be something boring. They could think about different ways of organizing those ideas, making it more interesting, using
Mhm.
many contemporary structures. So I think having an audience and purpose will perhaps get them going and maybe engage them and motivate them.
Yeah, and obviously, when you're talking about an audience, it's not just the teacher who's going to mark the writing.
Mm,
The audience is the other students in the class or the people in the
yeah,
school that need to know about this. And I think it's really important when we think about audiences that we make them like real life, and that
yeah.
definitely helps. That helps you generate ideas as well because or it helps you generate language as well because you know who you're speaking to, so you know what they're interested in, what they think about and care about. Um,
Yeah, that reminds me of an activity that I did with my lower secondary learners here at the British Council. The lesson was about writing reviews. So it
mhm,
was, so I got them to write restaurant reviews, and they were given a choice to publish those, on Google.
mhm,
So they were quite motivated because they were excited about other people reading their reviews in real time, and which
mhm,
means they were going to help other diners, choose restaurants.
mm.
So I think that can be a very engaging and a motivating experience for learners. So of course, giving them choice. I think we have to give them, the agency to whether or not to publish their work. But I think it's nice to, have that choice.
Yeah, yeah. And we've got some comments in the chat actually,
Oh
Huma.
yes.
There's one about talking about before writing ideas.
Mm.
I recommend children to represent the ideas in mind maps or flowcharts, and then they can find the gaps that will help them with their writing. And I think you've got some things related to that, haven't you? You've got some ideas
Oh,
about mind
yes, yes,
maps.
because module two of our teaching writing course has got lots of ideas, for
Mm.
generating ideas and organizing ideas. So here's an example, of a typical mind map that you can use at
Ah,
different levels. This is for
mhm.
primary learners. So, for example, if it's about their favorite animal, then the animal goes in the center, and then the branches could be food, habitat, appearance, abilities, and teachers could also include some sentence stems. For example, it lives in, and it eats, and for example, it has, and it can do different things. For example, it can fly, it can run, it can hop. So I think using, and as teachers, you can build these together with your learners. All you need
Mm.
is your classroom board, and you could give them, mini whiteboards, or they could use their own sheets, their notebooks. You could build these together, and then that could be used as a skeleton for their paragraph.
Yeah.
Stephen, we also talked about clarifying expectations, for our
Mhm.
primary learners, because as teachers, sometimes we might expect a lot from learners, in that age group. But
Mhm.
writing a sentence is also writing.
Mm.
So they don't
Yeah.
have to produce lots of sentences. So maybe some students might write only a couple of them saying, oh, it has fur and it can jump. That's about it, but that's also writing.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's enough as well to a certain extent.
Mm,
And I think what's nice about your kind of the mind map that you had there is obviously it's organized, so then
mm,
you can kind of organize the ideas as well afterwards. But I think it's I was thinking about it in kind of large classes,
mm.
and one thing I've done before is a kind of game where it's like write five or stop the bus as well if you know
Oh
that game.
yeah, nice.
Yeah, so when you've got like that topic, before you start the mind map, you give them another step beforehand where
Mm.
you do that kind of like with the mini whiteboard, where you say, okay, in your group, write five colors, and they just write five colors which they can use to describe the animal, or write five parts of the body, write five, I don't know, what can you say? Oh,
Things
like
they eat, things they
yeah,
eat.
exactly. Things they eat. So five animal foods, five things they can do. Yeah, five actions. And so they brainstorm that as a group first, and then you give them what you had, the mind map, to do as a kind of a more settling activity.
Oh
But they've
yeah.
already generated those ideas, and then they can like create that mind map, and then from that go into the writing. Because I think the scaffolding
Oh yes.
is very important when it comes to generating ideas, because it's not just okay, think of all the your opinion about climate change, for example. It's
Mm.
not just that because that's hard, like you said. You need those
Yeah.
steps to get them to the point where they can think of those ideas.
Oh, I love your idea, Stephen. I think that can be a very good scaffold, a springboard for learners to also think about what they know in their own languages. So,
Mm,
when you play, that game, Stop the Bus, it doesn't have to be in English,
no.
so they could first ideate in their own languages, and then the teacher could support them, so to slowly think about, ideas in English, so maybe they've written something, an animal food in their language, but oh, so what do you say that, how do you say
Mm,
that in English, so making, forming those bridges, I think, especially, which is, I think, very useful, especially, in primary classrooms and even other classrooms where you have learners with mixed abilities.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And obviously, I mean, that's using kind of like the knowledge that they already have. And we talked about using realia, but there are other things we can use as well to help them generate ideas. Um, So what other things do you use apart from like Realia and um,
Yeah, I mean, there was
yeah.
another idea from our course teaching writing, Stephen,
Oh,
that
okay.
that I find useful, that I also use in my class, and that was using chain diagrams.
Ah, okay.
For Yeah, because for example, the topic could be, how plants grow, and then students could, make a chain diagram, and this
Hmm.
can again become, become the skeleton of the paragraph. So So you can, and this is, I think, very useful for writing tasks where students have to describe processes or
Yeah.
maybe cause and effect. And that reminds me of IELTS writing activities,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
where learners have to
Process.
describe, diagrams and charts, etc. So I think they can use chain diagrams, to visualize, and you have a diagram there, and sometimes there are missing parts, and then there are parts, that you can't, really visualize. So students can come up with their own chain diagrams and see, how they can, fill in those missing gaps.
Definitely, and you can use images as well. I think
Mm,
in that situation. So, for example, like you had there like the growth of a plant,
mm,
or, you could also do it like my daughter's actually done it recently with like a water cycle,
nice.
where you have to kind of you get the stages. I mean, one thing that's quite nice to do with learners, and this can be used not just for things like processes, but also for stories,
Oh
um,
yeah.
is, is when you give them cards with images on, and they have to order the story
Mm,
first. And then once they've ordered the story, then they can look at the language and they get that from it, and then you can kind of move into maybe writing it. One thing I've done um, in classes before actually is cut up the story. So let's say you've got 8 parts of the story, but you give the cards out to the class and they only have one card each. So they don't know the whole school story, they only know one part of it. And they look
mm,
at it and maybe they take notes on what they can see, and then they go around the classroom and share it. And then hopefully they end up with the whole story, or a description of all the different parts. And then once they've got those descriptions, they work together in a group to kind of arrange those descriptions into a story. And they can do it how they want. Like it doesn't have to
mm.
be like, oh, this is the original story. Although what you can do after that is provide them with the original story and say, look at this story, compare it with yours. Let's look at some of the differences, some of the language, and then you can then maybe rewrite it afterwards. But using images is really, really helpful, I think, for that.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant idea, Stephen. That also reminds me of another idea,
Mm.
in from module 3 of our course that also talks about picture stories, but it's a slightly different
Oh,
from
okay.
what you just mentioned. So there, the module 3 suggests that students come together, they put those pictures in order, and then they regroup. They work with a different partner or
Oh,
different
okay.
group, and they look at their order, because not all groups might have the same order,
Mm.
so, and then they listen to their story, and then they work, and then they regroup again, so maybe a few times, so they listen to a few different stories, and then they decide which story to go with, which means they
Oh,
have a
okay.
few different ways, few different ways of conceptualizing the story, and then they choose the one that they like the best, which means they draw ideas with different people and different groups in the classroom. I think that was a
Okay.
very good idea from the course.
No, no, that's really nice, especially because of like the different perspectives and the different
Mm,
ways of seeing the story, which is nice. And then students can kind of choose which ones they like the most. So that's good. I mean, a similar thing to that I've done before is not jigsaw reading, but jigsaw listening,
mm.
where the learners go into separate rooms,
Rooms, yes.
um,
I've done that
and
too.
yeah, and they have like different stories. They have to take notes on the stories, which
Mm,
I think is one way to kind of generate ideas. And then they can come back together, and then they put those two stories together to make a whole um, story, which
yeah.
is useful. Um, there are some other comments, I think, in the chat. There's one here about using multicolored charts,
Mm,
which can definitely help because obviously they're appealing. Although we need to obviously prepare those a little bit. And there's a comment here as well about using stories to use like talk about their personal experiences to
yeah.
generate ideas. And I think that's a good place to start for generating ideas. Is obviously the people's personal um, experience.
Yeah, there's another one, Stephen. I think this is a fantastic
Oh
idea.
yeah.
This viewer is saying, oh, I lost that. Oh, it's here. That each learner contributes a setting, a personality, or a job for the different characters in the story. And then, they come together and see how they can work with those ideas. I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier. So you got groups, you divide your class into groups, and maybe each group works with a different theme, or maybe different part part of the story, or the writing activity, and then they bring their ideas together.
No, no, it's a really nice idea. And I think one thing that's nice about that is what we were talking about before about making sure that it's scaffolded and you've got the
Mm,
steps to support the generation of ideas, you've got the steps to support the writing. And I think that's one thing that's always important, really, because you're giving them some a kind of clear target. Like here is
yeah.
a personality type. Write that down. Write down a setting, a place, or write down like a problem.
Mm,
And so, yeah, no, that's a really really good idea. I think being specific is something that when you're generating ideas is very important because, like, yeah, give me your ideas about climate change is not a useful. It's not a useful prompt, even for
no,
most people. No, I don't think I
yeah,
could. I mean, like,
yeah,
what do you
yeah,
say?
me neither. No, I would
Yeah,
struggle
yeah,
definitely.
um,
Stephen, that also reminds me about differentiation. I know we've talked about this in our previous live events. I
mhm,
think the starting point, should be setting goals, because when you set writing goals, it can be very intimidating for learners, because not everybody can, dish out a 200-word essay about climate change. So I think it's important to set realistic goals. For example, I think our other courses, for example, managing learners and resources, talks about differentiation and how we can set goals, differentiate
mhm,
the outcome, which means that everybody achieves, the same goal, but they have different levels of support, or they do different activities. So, for example, there'll be, a certain set of students who might not need any support, and they write those 150 words, about climate change. And there might be those whose goal should be maybe just filling in the gaps. So you
yeah,
give them, a gap fill activity, and they have to just fill in those gaps. And then there will be others who might have some word banks, and they could choose, maybe ideas, idea banks too, maybe idea banks and word banks, and they could combine those two to, those students in the middle, they could combine those two to generate, their paragraphs. So I think we also need to set realistic goals when you get your learners to write, because I think that comes before idea generation. If the goals are realistic, then maybe,
mhm.
that will reduce the cognitive load, and maybe, students are will be more willing to engage with the activity.
No, that's a really good point. Like, and giving targets for what you
Mm,
want at each stage, and having choice around those targets. Like you said, like maybe some students can write 100 words, but other ones can do 150 or 200. And
yeah.
it's good to give those kind of boundaries, and then the learners can decide. Oh, I'm feeling a bit tired today. I'll just do 100 words.
Mm,
That kind of thing.
exactly.
No, but I think, yeah, I think it's important. But I like that. I think the targets are very very useful,
Mm,
and especially when it comes to generating ideas, because um, like let's say we go back to the example of climate change because we talked about it a couple of times. Um, but
yeah.
um, but like if you're saying, okay, we're going to talk about climate change, you need to say, okay, write 5 problems that you have with the environment where you live, kind of thing, and they
Mm,
actually have to think, okay, I've got to get 5, because that's a target and it's a task, and I think it's easier. But also when you're generating ideas, um, it's good to, like you said before, Huma, with that activity where the learners kind of regroup.
yeah.
I think one thing to remember is when you have like the mind map that you had before, is they could do it on their own first, maybe to
Mm,
think. Then they could do it on pairs, in pair, sorry, and then once they've finished it, and they can pass it to the next group, and the next group can add the ideas that they had about it that were maybe different, and then you just pass the papers around the room, basically, so
mm.
it keeps on adding and adding and adding, so that by the end, when it comes back to you, instead of just having 3 words about the appearance, there may be like 15
Oh
that you
yeah.
can choose from. And I think that kind of, and that works well in a large class as well, because like if you've got a larger class, you've got more brains, and more ideas, so that you can end up with quite a lot, even
Yeah,
if it's,
indeed.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that reminds me of the different kinds of, brainstorming
Mm,
activities and the interactions that we can use in the classroom. For example, um, we could set up think pair share where students think together and then they share their ideas. You could have gallery walk, with flip charts all around the room with different questions. I think this came up with from one of our community members who suggested creating
Mhm.
multiple questions about the topic with students answer in groups, and then they put those questions into order. So you could also
Yeah.
do that, using the walls of your classroom. So you could have flip charts with different questions, and students could go around, adding ideas. And if you're working with large classes, they could first brainstorm those their answers to those questions in their groups, and they could choose one representative who could then go around, filling in, those charts for the group. So you could do those gallery walks, those carousel writing activities. So I think large classes, don't have to be intimidating. I think they can be, useful places for idea generation, and working together.
Yeah, and I think I like the idea of the gallery walks,
Mm,
and because I mean it's movement, isn't it? But also the
yes.
fact that you have the different questions on different sheets is really nice. You could also, in a large class, let's say if you've got the fixed tables,
Mm,
what you could do is you can give different questions to different rows, and when they finish writing their ideas, they pass it to the row behind them, who then add more ideas, and then it goes back and forth, and then eventually you get your paper back with all the different ideas on, that you could share. So there's different ways that you can do that, and I think it's sometimes better in a large class because
yes.
you've got more ideas, you've got more people, um, whereas sometimes in smaller classes it can be harder.
Yeah, and I think these ideas can also be easily adapted for online teaching. For example, you could
Hmm.
have those breakout rooms, and people could work with collaborative documents, or maybe Padlet where they ideate, so where they work on different aspects of the writing activity, and then they come together and see what ideas they can draw from each other.
Yeah, yeah, or even just using like a word, an online Word document
Yeah, or a
where you
Google
have
Doc,
like a
yes.
table and
Mm,
you can put the ideas in the table. So it's similar to like your idea of a gallery walk, but
yeah.
it's just online instead. Um, okay.
Stephen, there's a comment about the use of phones here. I think, then
Ooh.
it also reminds us about the use of technology and AI. So what do we have to say about that? Because today it's not a question about whether or not we are going to use AI. I think it's about guiding the use of AI for
Hmm.
writing and other learning activities in the classroom. So what do we have to say about this, Steve?
Well, I mean, the thing is, AI can generate ideas incredibly fast.
Yeah.
So maybe you can get the ideas from the AI, but I think what's important is kind of curating the ideas,
Mm,
so that the ideas are the ones that are important to you, so you can select them and maybe agree or disagree with the ideas that that the AI gives, and then you can kind of draft from the AI. I mean, at least that's how I would do it. But you mentioned about using prompts before, and maybe thinking about the prompt that you use.
Yes, I think we talked about climate,
Yeah.
last week, and we also talked about the judicious and reasonable use
Mm.
of AI in our classrooms. And I remember you made a very good point last time about how, using multiple prompts, can lead to a lot of energy consumption, which means more destruction, of the environment.
Mm.
So I think before you even get your learners to use AI to generate ideas, to get support with writing, I think we have to train, our learners in generating AI prompts more effectively. So maybe students can work together to
Mhm.
and think about how they would prompt AI. So they could come up with a few different ways of prompting AI, for a particular writing activity, and
Yeah.
then choose the most effective prompt that the whole class can then use for getting support from AI. So I think it starts with prompting more
Yeah.
effectively, because we also have to think about the environment. And once you have those responses from AI, I usually get my learners to compare their ideas with what they've got from AI. So I get them to
Mm.
brainstorm ideas in groups first,
Oh,
and
that's a
then
good
they
idea.
prompt AI, and then they
Mm.
compare and see if there's anything that they want to take or steal from AI, and then
Hmm.
maybe adapt it, for their own, personal writing activities. So I think this is important because plagiarism is something that we have to be mindful of as teachers. It's
Hmm.
okay to use AI to get support, but you cannot, claim their ideas, as our own. So I think we have to teach our learners to use AI, and also maintain academic integrity. Um, so I think why not get your learners, like I said, brainstorm ideas and then compare those,
I think
that they
that's
got from
I
AI.
think that's a really good idea, Huma, because I think one thing that AI can take away is the thinking process of coming up
Yes.
with ideas. And if you don't do it yourself, if you're
Yeah.
always relying on the AI to generate those ideas for you, you haven't gone through the process yourself. So
Yeah.
it's not as sticky. It's not as good a learning um, process. Really, you lose the learning when you're not doing it yourself because
Indeed.
you're relying on something else. Okay, well, I think we've discussed quite a lot today. We've got through
Yes.
quite a lot.
Yes. And time has flown by, Stephen, as
Yeah,
always.
definitely. So obviously, if you're interested in more ideas about how to teach writing, please go to the course, and there's a
Yeah.
workbook there with lots of resources in that you can use as well. Um, Next week, we're going to be talking about organising the classroom, and Zainab is coming back, which means that Huma's going. So thank you very
Oh,
much,
yeah.
Huma, for
Thank you,
being with
Stephen.
us.
Thank you, everybody.
And yeah, hope to see you again in the future. And thank you for all the ideas that you've shared and all the support that you've given to the people in the community as well.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It was a pleasure working with you and Zainab and with all the community members. I think I've learned as much as they have, perhaps from our community. So I'm walking away with a lot of ideas too. So thank you very much, everybody. And we hope to see you next week.
Yes, definitely. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.
Thank you and bye bye.
How to see more of our videos on YouTube. When using a shared device, check you're logged into your YouTube account. Do this by tapping the profile on the main menu. When sure you're in the right account, select Search from the top menu. Search for the British Council Teaching English channel and select it. Look down the page for British Council Teaching English. Tap on it. This is our channel. To be alerted whenever we share a video, tap Subscribe. Then tap Subscribed. Select All to be notified of all our new videos. To see these notifications, tap on the bell in the top menu.